The city of Tacoma, Washington, wore its late October chill like a second skin. The kind of cold that seeped through jacket seams and settled in the bones, turning breath into small clouds of vapor that hung in the streetlight glow. It was the hour between shifts, that peculiar twilight when the day workers had gone home and the night crowd hadn't yet claimed the streets. The industrial district near the waterfront lay quiet, punctuated only by the distant horn of a cargo ship and the rhythmic clang of shipping containers being loaded at the port. On the corner of Maritime Avenue and 5th Street stood Rosie's Diner, a relic from the 1950s that had somehow survived urban renewal, chain restaurants, and the slow exodus of blue-collar workers to the suburbs. Its neon sign, a cheerful pink script that read, "Rosie's, open 24 hours," flickered with a comforting persistence, a beacon of warmth in the gathering dusk. Inside, the air was thick with the holy trinity of diner smells: fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and the yeasty sweetness of fresh baked pie. The black and white checkered floor gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the vintage jukebox in the corner played a soft Patsy Cline ballad. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, and a long Formica counter stretched the length of the room, its chrome edge polished to a mirror shine. For Jack Reeves, this wasn't just a diner. It was a decompression chamber, a place where the noise in his head could finally quiet down to a manageable hum. He sat in the last booth by the kitchen, his broad shoulders filling the space, his back to the wall. It was a tactical habit he couldn't break, even here, even now. From this position, he had a clear view of the entire diner, the front door, the side exit that led to the alley, and the street beyond the rain-streaked windows. Jack was a man built of quiet angles and coiled strength. At 32, his face was clean-shaven, his dark hair cut military short, showing the first hints of silver at the temples. His eyes, a deep, watchful gray, moved with a practiced economy, taking in details most people missed. The way the cook's hands shook slightly when he plated the eggs. The nervous energy of the young couple in booth 3, sitting on the same side, their shoulders pressed together. The older man at the counter, a regular, reading his newspaper with the slow deliberation of someone who had nowhere else to be. Jack's hands rested on the table, broad and scarred, wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. The heat felt good against his palms. He took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth ground him in the present moment. Beneath the table, pressed against his left leg, was Havoc. The Belgian Malinois was a magnificent animal, 90 pounds of lean muscle and tactical precision. His coat was a rich fawn color with a black mask that made his amber eyes seem to glow with an almost preternatural intelligence. He lay in a sphinx position, perfectly still, his head resting on his paws, but his ears were constantly moving, rotating like satellite dishes, tracking every sound in the diner. Havoc wasn't a pet. He was Jack's partner, his brother in arms, and the reason Jack had made it home from his last deployment with his sanity mostly intact. They had been discharged from the Navy 6 months ago. Both of them. Jack, because 3 tours as a SEAL had left him with too many ghosts and a startle reflex that made civilian life a minefield. Havoc, because a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder had ended his career as a military working dog. The injury had healed, but the Navy had strict standards. A dog who couldn't pass the full physical assessment couldn't serve. So they had come home together, 2 warriors trying to figure out how to be something else. Jack had found work as a maritime security consultant, a job that required very little human interaction and let him use his skill set without the weight of a weapon. But it was the quiet moments, like this, that were the hardest. The silence between missions, the space where his mind could wander into dark corners he had spent years trying to avoid. That's where Rosie's came in. He came here 3 nights a week, always at the same time. 6:30 p.m., right after the dinner rush but before the late-night crowd. He ordered the same thing: black coffee, a ribeye steak cooked medium rare, and scrambled eggs. It was the breakfast he'd dreamed about in the desert, the meal that tasted like home. And every time, without fail, his waitress was Emma. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Emma Chen was 24 years old, though her quiet competence made her seem older. She had the kind of face that held a story: high cheekbones, dark almond eyes that missed nothing, and a small scar that cut through her left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood accident she never talked about. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the diner's uniform, a pale blue dress with a white apron, with a quiet dignity that somehow made it look less like a costume and more like armor. She had been working at Rosie's for 2 years, saving every penny she could. Emma was a graduate student at the University of Washington, studying social work, trying to build a life that mattered. The diner job paid her rent, her tuition, and kept food in the bowl of the one companion who made her small studio apartment feel like home. That companion was currently curled up in the diner's back office, a privilege Rosie, the owner, had granted after Emma had begged. Bella was a golden retriever mix, 8 years old, with a graying muzzle and soulful brown eyes that could melt the coldest heart. She had been a rescue, found tied to a dumpster 3 years ago, starving and terrified. Emma had taken one look at her and known they were meant to save each other. Bella was the gentlest creature Emma had ever known. She didn't have a mean bone in her body. She greeted every person with a wagging tail and an open heart. She slept at the foot of Emma's bed and walked with her to the bus stop every morning, waiting patiently until Emma disappeared around the corner before trotting back home. Emma loved her with a fierceness that surprised her. Bella was family, the only family she had left after her parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Tonight, Bella had been restless. Emma had noticed it when she'd brought her to work, the way the dog kept whining softly, pressing her nose against the office door, trying to follow Emma out onto the floor. It was unusual. Bella was normally content to sleep on the old blanket Emma had laid out for her. "She's probably just picking up on the weather," Rosie had said, glancing at the darkening sky visible through the kitchen window. "Dogs know when a storm's coming." Emma had nodded, but something about Bella's behavior had unsettled her. Still, she had a job to do. She had given the dog a treat, scratched behind her ears, and promised to check on her during her break. Now, she approached Jack's booth, the coffee pot in one hand, her order pad in the other. "Evening, Jack," she said, her voice soft but warm. "The usual?" Jack looked up, and for a moment his watchful expression softened. Emma was one of the few people who didn't try to fill his silence with nervous chatter. She understood that he was there to be quiet, to exist in a space that didn't demand anything from him. "Evening, Emma," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That sounds right." She filled his mug, the stream of coffee perfectly controlled. Not a drop spilled. Then her gaze dropped to the floor, where Havoc's amber eyes were watching her with calm intelligence. "And how's the best boy in Tacoma doing tonight?" she asked, crouching down beside the booth. Havoc's tail began a slow, rhythmic thump against the floor. He leaned forward, pressing his muzzle into her outstretched hand, and Emma laughed softly, scratching him in his favorite spot, just behind his right ear. "Did you have a good week?" she whispered to the dog. "Did you keep this one out of trouble?" Jack watched the exchange, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Emma was one of the few people who treated Havoc not as a weapon or a curiosity, but simply as a very good dog. And she was one of the few people who seemed to understand that Jack didn't need sympathy or small talk. He just needed to be left alone in the warm, quiet hum of the diner. "I'll get that right in for you," Emma said, standing and giving Jack a quick smile before heading back toward the kitchen window. As she walked away, Jack heard her exchange a few quiet words with Rosie, who was working the register. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the diner was small and sound carried. "I'm worried about Bella," Emma murmured, rubbing her temples. "She's been so anxious tonight. I've never seen her like this." Rosie, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and hands that had served 1,000 meals, patted Emma's arm. "You're a good soul, taking care of that dog the way you do. She's lucky to have you. Why don't you check on her during your next break? I can cover the floor for a few minutes." "Thanks, Rosie," Emma said, her voice grateful. Jack absorbed the exchange, filing it away. It was part of the sanctuary of this place. Good people, working hard, being kind to each other. It was a simple, uncomplicated goodness that he had missed desperately when he was deployed. A reminder that not everything in the world was broken. Emma returned a few minutes later, balancing a heavy plate. She set it down in front of him with practiced care. "Here you go. Ribeye and eggs, medium rare." Then, just as she always did, she set down a small side plate with 2 extra strips of bacon, ostensibly for Jack. But as she placed it on the table, one of those strips accidentally slipped off the edge, landing perfectly on a clean napkin she'd placed on the floor beside her foot, well within Havoc's reach. "Oh, clumsy me," she whispered, her eyes twinkling as she looked down at the dog. "Floor bacon. Guess we can't use that now." Havoc, who had been watching this performance with the focus of a trained operative, waited. He looked at Jack, his amber eyes patient and questioning. Jack gave the smallest, most imperceptible nod. The dog leaned forward and delicately, almost reverently, took the bacon from the napkin. His jaws made a single satisfying crunch. Emma turned back to Jack, her face composed, but her smile lived in her eyes. "Anything else I can get for you, Jack?" "This is perfect, Emma," he said. "Thank you." She nodded and moved on to the next table, refilling coffee cups and taking orders with the same quiet efficiency. Jack cut into his steak, the blade slicing through the tender meat with ease. The first bite was heaven, perfectly seasoned, cooked exactly right. He could feel the tension he carried in his shoulders, the hypervigilance that hummed under his skin like a live wire, finally begin to recede. He was in his booth. His dog was at his feet. The coffee was hot and the food was real. He was safe. They were safe. For this one evening, the world was a perfect, fragile piece of peace. Emma's shift had been steady but not overwhelming. The dinner rush had thinned out, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered across the diner. Mr. Peterson, the elderly man at the counter, was on his second slice of apple pie, reading his newspaper with the slow, methodical attention of someone savoring every word. The young couple in booth 3 had left, replaced by a trucker who sat quietly eating his meatloaf, his rig idling in the parking lot outside. It was the kind of quiet Emma preferred, busy enough to keep her mind occupied, slow enough that she wasn't running herself ragged. She moved through, her routine with practiced ease. refilling coffee, clearing plates, wiping down tables. It was meditative in a way. The repetition allowed her mind to wander, to think about her thesis proposal, about the evening class she was teaching next week at the community center. But beneath it all, a nagging worry persisted. Bella. During her last break, Emma had slipped into the back office to check on her. The dog had been pacing, her tail low, her ears pinned back. When Emma had knelt down, Bella had pressed herself against her legs, whining softly, her whole body trembling. "Hey, girl," Emma had whispered, running her hands over the dog's soft fur. "What's wrong? You're okay. I'm right here." But Bella wouldn't settle. Her dark eyes kept darting toward the door, toward the alley exit, as if she sensed something Emma couldn't see. Emma had stayed with her for 10 minutes, speaking in soothing tones, offering treats that Bella refused. Finally, reluctantly, she'd had to return to the floor. Rosie had promised to keep an ear out, to let Emma know if the dog's distress escalated. Now, as Emma cleared table 6, she glanced toward the kitchen, toward the small hallway that led to the office. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She was about to ask Rosie if she could take another quick break when the bell above the diner's front door chimed. The sound was ordinary, just the cheerful jingle that announced every customer. But something about the way the door opened made Emma's shoulders tense. 3 men walked in. They moved wrong. That was the first thing she noticed. Their movements were jerky, aggressive, their eyes scanning the room with a predatory sharpness that set off every alarm bell in her hind brain. The first man, the apparent leader, was tall and wiry, his face gaunt and pale. He wore a stained denim jacket over a black hoodie, and his hands, shoved deep in his pockets, twitched with a nervous, strung-out energy. His eyes were sunken and dark, darting constantly, never settling. This was Vince. The second was shorter, stockier, with a thick neck and a shaved head. He wore a leather jacket that barely contained his bulk, and his face was set in a permanent scowl. He moved like a man who was used to using his size to intimidate. This was Paulie. The third was younger, barely out of his teens, with greasy hair and a patchy attempt at a beard. He wore oversized jeans and a hoodie pulled up over his head, his hands buried in his pockets. He kept glancing at Vince, waiting for cues, his body language screaming follower. This was sketch. They didn't sit down. They didn't approach the counter. They just stood inside the door, blocking it. Their presence a sudden, ugly intrusion into the diner's warm sanctuary. Emma felt her pulse quicken. She was holding a tray of dirty dishes, frozen halfway between the booth and the kitchen. Something about these men was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Rosie, standing behind the register, seemed to sense it too. Her welcoming smile faltered, her hand tightening on the edge of the counter. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Grab any seat you'd like. I'll be right with you." Vince's gaze swept the room, lingering on each person, calculating, assessing. His eyes passed over Mr. Peterson, the trucker, and then landed on Emma. He smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Actually," he said, his voice high and reedy, "we're not here to eat." He pulled his hand from his pocket, and in it was a small black revolver. The world stopped. The moment the gun appeared, the diner's warm atmosphere shattered like glass. Mr. Peterson gasped, his newspaper slipping from his hands. The trucker froze mid-bite, his fork clattering onto his plate. Rosie's hand flew to her mouth, her face going pale. "Nobody move," Vince said, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "Nobody be a hero. Hands where I can see them." Paulie moved with brutal efficiency. pulling the door shut behind them and flipping the deadbolt. The metallic click echoed through the diner like a gunshot. He then grabbed the small neon open sign hanging in the window and flipped it to closed. Sketch, following his cue, pulled a rusty crowbar from under his hoodie, gripping it with both hands. His eyes were wide, his breathing fast and shallow. He was terrified, which made him dangerous. Wallets, phones, purse, everything on the counter. "Now," Vince barked, waving the gun in a wide arc that swept across the room. This wasn't a professional operation. It was desperation wrapped in violence. These were men who had run out of options, who had nothing left to lose. And that made them unpredictable. Mr. Peterson, his hands shaking, slowly reached for his wallet, fumbling it out of his back pocket. The trucker did the same, his massive hands moving with exaggerated care. Rosie, her voice trembling, spoke up. "Please, boys, just take the register. We won't call the police. Just take it and go." "Shut up, old lady," Paulie snarled, stepping toward her. "We'll tell you what we're taking." In the back booth, Jack's world had already shifted into a different gear. The moment Vince had walked through the door, Jack had felt it. The familiar cold clarity that descended when the world became a battlefield. The warm, soft focus of the diner had sharpened into high-definition tactical precision. He hadn't moved. His fork was still in his hand, halfway to his mouth, the steak cooling on his plate. But beneath the table, his right hand had dropped to rest on Havoc's head, applying firm, steady pressure. Hold. Stand down. The dog had gone rigid, every muscle in his body coiled, his focus locked on the three men. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in his chest, but Jack's hand was a physical command, an anchor that kept the animal from acting. Jack's eyes moved in a precise, practiced pattern, gathering intelligence. Threat 1. Vince. Primary. Armed with revolver, small caliber, looks like a .38, grip is sloppy, finger on the trigger, amped up, probably on something, unpredictable, distance 35 feet. Threat 2, Paulie, secondary, unarmed but large, capable of blunt force trauma, blocking exit, distance 30 feet. Threat 3, Sketch, tertiary, armed with crowbar, nervous, reactive, weak link, distance 25 feet. His gaze flicked to the civilians. Rosie, behind counter, exposed. Mr. Peterson, booth 2, elderly, vulnerable, trucker. Booth 4, capable but compliant. Emma. His eyes found her. She was standing in the center of the room, the tray of dirty dishes still in her hands, her face pale but her eyes sharp, calculating. She was afraid, but she wasn't frozen. She was thinking. Emma, mid-room, exposed, no cover, most vulnerable. And then Vince's gun swung toward her. "You," he said, his voice a harsh rasp. "Pretty girl with the tray. Put it down. Slow." Emma's hands were steady as she lowered the tray onto the nearest table. She kept her movements deliberate, non-threatening, her eyes never leaving Vince's face. "Good," Vince said, stepping closer. "Now, empty your apron. Tips, cash, everything. Into the pile." Emma's fingers moved to the pocket of her apron, pulling out a small wad of bills and some change. It was maybe $40, the tips from her shift. She placed it on the counter, her jaw tight. Paulie laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "That's it? That's all you got? What kind of dump is this?" Vince's face twisted with frustration. "The register," he snapped at Rosie. "Open it, now." Rosie, her hands shaking violently, moved to the old mechanical register. It was a relic, a heavy chrome beast that required a key and a series of buttons to open. She fumbled with the key, her fingers slipping. Come on," Vince hissed, his impatience growing. He was losing control, his high wearing off, reality crashing in. He needed this to go faster. He needed to get out. But the register wasn't cooperating. Rosie's hands were shaking too badly. "I'm trying," she sobbed. "Please, I'm trying. Try harder," Vince screamed, and he swung the gun, smashing it against the counter with a sharp crack that made everyone in the diner flinch. It was that sound, the sharp, violent crack of metal on formica, that triggered the next terrible escalation. From the back office, muffled but unmistakable, came a sound that made Emma's blood run cold. A bark, sharp, alarmed, protective. Bella. Vince's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. What was that? Emma's heart stopped. "It's nothing," she said quickly, her voice tight. Just a stray outside. Please, just take the money." But Sketch, jittery and paranoid, was already moving toward the hallway that led to the back office. "There's a dog back there," he said, his voice high with suspicion. "What if it's a guard dog? What if there's a cop back there?" "There's no cop," Emma said, desperation creeping into her voice. "It's just my dog. She's old. She's harmless. Please." Paulie grabbed Emma's arm, his thick fingers digging into her flesh. "Your dog? You brought a dog to work?" She's sick," Emma lied, trying to pull free. "She needed to be near me. She won't hurt anyone." Vince's paranoia, fueled by whatever drugs were coursing through his system, latched onto the idea like a drowning man grabbing a rope. "A sick dog that's barking? I don't think so. Sketch, go check it out." "No," Emma cried, struggling against Paulie's grip. "Please, leave her alone." But Sketch was already pushing through the kitchen, heading for the office door. And in that moment, Jack knew 3 things with absolute certainty. 1. This robbery was spiraling out of control. 2. Emma was about to do something brave and stupid. And 3. The time for waiting was almost over. The office door was flimsy, nothing more than hollow core wood with a simple handle. Sketch didn't bother with subtlety. He kicked it open, the door slamming against the interior wall with a bang that echoed through the kitchen. Inside, on a faded blanket in the corner, Bella scrambled to her feet. The old golden retriever's hackles were raised, her ears pinned back. But she didn't charge. She didn't growl with menace. She simply stood there, her body trembling, her dark eyes fixed on the stranger in the doorway. She was protecting the only thing she knew how to protect. Her space, her person's space. But there was no aggression in her, only fear and confusion. Sketch saw a dog, a big dog, and his drug-addled paranoia transformed her into a threat. "It's a guard dog," he yelled back toward the dining room. "It's gonna attack." "No!" Emma screamed, finally wrenching free from Paulie's grip. "She won't. She's not." But Sketch raised the crowbar. Bella, seeing the movement, the raised weapon, did what her gentle nature dictated. She backed up, pressing herself against the wall, her tail tucked, a soft whimper escaping her throat. She was terrified. Sketch swung anyway. The crowbar connected with Bella's shoulder with a sickening, wet thud. The dog let out a sharp, agonized yelp, a sound of pure, betrayed pain, and collapsed onto her side, her legs scrabbling uselessly against the floor. Emma's scream was a raw, primal thing that tore through the diner like a blade. "Bella!" She didn't think. She just ran. She shoved past Paulie, knocking over a chair in her desperation, and sprinted toward the kitchen, toward her dog, toward the sound of that terrible, heartbreaking whimper. Paulie caught her halfway through the kitchen, his thick arm wrapping around her waist, yanking her back. "Where do you think you're going?" "Let me go," Emma shrieked, kicking, clawing, fighting with a strength born of pure desperation. "He hurt her. Let me go." Vince, his face contorted with rage and panic, rushed into the kitchen. The robbery was falling apart. The dog was making noise. The waitress was screaming. This was supposed to be simple. In and out. Easy money. "Shut her up," he snarled at Polly. "Get her outside. We need to go. Now." "The side exit," Polly grunted, already dragging the struggling Emma toward the door that led to the alley. "Come on." Emma fought like a wildcat, her nails raking across Polly's face, drawing blood. He cursed, his grip tightening painfully around her ribs, squeezing the air from her lungs. "You little—" He shoved the alley door open with his shoulder, the cold October air rushing in, and hurled Emma out into the darkness. She hit the wet pavement hard, her palms and knees scraping against the rough asphalt. Pain flared up her arms, but she was already trying to push herself up to get back to Bella, to get back to her dog who was hurt and alone, and a boot caught her in the side. Polly's kick was brutal, delivered with the full force of his weight. It lifted Emma off the ground and sent her sprawling against the brick wall of the alley. The impact drove the air from her lungs in a whooshing gasp, and for a moment the world went white with pain. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could only feel the sharp, stabbing agony in her ribs and the cold, rough brick against her cheek. Vince and Sketch came through the door behind Polly, their faces twisted with panic and rage. The robbery had failed. The register had yielded maybe $200, and now they had a witness who had seen their faces, who knew what they'd done. "We can't leave her," Sketch said, his voice shaking. "She saw us. She'll call the cops." "Then we make sure she can't," Vince said, his voice cold and flat. He raised his boot and brought it down on Emma's outstretched hand. The crack of bone was audible even over Emma's scream. Her index and middle fingers bent at unnatural angles, white-hot pain shooting up her arm like electricity. She curled into herself, trying to protect her broken hand, trying to breathe through the agony, but Polly grabbed her by the hair and hauled her upright, slamming her back against the wall. "You should have just stayed quiet," Polly hissed, his breath hot and sour against her face. "Should have just let us take the money." Emma's vision swam, tears streaming down her face, but through the haze of pain, one thought burned with desperate clarity. Bella. I have to get back to Bella. She tried to speak, to beg, but her voice came out as a broken rasp. "Please, my dog. She needs—" Vince slapped her, hard, the crack of his palm against her cheek echoing in the narrow alley. "Your dog's probably dead, sweetheart, and if you don't shut up, you will be too." Inside the diner, the silence was deafening. Mr. Peterson sat frozen in his booth, his hands over his mouth, staring at the kitchen door through which Emma had disappeared. The trucker had risen from his seat, his massive fists clenched, but he was unarmed, outmatched, and he knew it. Rosie stood behind the counter, tears streaming down her face. The register finally open, its meager contents spilled across the counter. "Please," she whispered to no one. "Please, someone help her." In the back booth, Jack had watched every second of the violent escalation with the cold, analytical clarity of an operator. The moment Sketch had entered the back office, Jack had known what was coming. The moment Emma had run, he had known where this would end. And the moment the crowbar had connected with the dog, the wet, sickening thud followed by that sharp, agonized yelp, something inside him had shifted. Beneath the table, Havoc had felt it too. The Belgian Malinois had gone from coiled tension to vibrating fury. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a silent snarl, his entire body a loaded weapon waiting for the command to fire. But Jack's hand remained firm on his head. Not yet. He had waited through the struggle. He had waited as Polly dragged Emma toward the alley door. He had waited as they disappeared into the darkness. He waited because the civilians were still in the line of fire. He waited because Vince still had a gun, and panic made amateurs deadly. He waited because moving too soon would get someone killed. But now, the threats had removed themselves from the diner. They had taken their violence outside into the alley. They had isolated themselves. The board had changed. Jack stood. The movement was fluid, controlled, utterly silent. He was out of the booth and moving toward the kitchen before Rosie even realized he'd left his seat. Havoc was at his side, no longer held back, moving like a shadow. The trucker saw him and stepped aside, his eyes wide. "They've got a gun," he said. "I know," Jack replied, his voice flat and emotionless. It was the voice of the operator, stripped of everything but purpose. He reached the kitchen and paused at the alley door, which Polly had left hanging open. The cold night air poured in, carrying with it the sound of voices, harsh and cruel, and beneath them, a soft, broken sobbing. "Emma." Jack's hand dropped to Havoc's collar, and he gave a single silent command in German. "Bei Fuß," heel. The dog moved into position, his body pressed against Jack's left leg, waiting. Jack's eyes adjusted to the darkness of the alley. He could see them now, 3 shapes, backlit by the distant streetlight at the alley's mouth. Emma was on the ground, crumpled against the wall, her body shaking. The 3 men stood over her, their postures aggressive, predatory, and then Jack heard it. The sound that made the cold fury in his chest crystallize into something sharp and final. Vince was laughing. "What are you going to do, sweetheart? Cry us to death?" Jack stepped through the door and into the alley. His boots made no sound on the wet pavement. He was a ghost, a shadow moving through the darkness. The men didn't see him. They were too focused on their victim, too high on their own cruelty. It was Sketch who noticed first. He turned, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, and his eyes widened. Vince." Vince turned, irritation flashing across his face. "What?" And then he saw Jack, a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing in the alley entrance, his face calm, his eyes cold and gray as winter steel, and beside him, a dog, not a pet, a weapon. Its amber eyes glowed in the dim light, its lips curled back to reveal white fangs. For a moment, no one moved. And then Jack spoke. His voice was low, quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was not a shout. It was a command, delivered with the certainty of a man who knew he would be obeyed. "Let her go." Vince stared at the man in the alley entrance, his drug-fogged brain struggling to process the sudden, unexpected intrusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were in control. They had the girl. They had the gun. But something about this man, the way he stood, the absolute stillness in his posture, the way the dog at his side watched them with the focused intensity of a predator, triggered a deep, primal alarm. "Who the hell are you?" Vince demanded, his voice cracking. He raised the revolver, pointing it at Jack with a shaking hand. "Back off, man. This doesn't concern you." Jack didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze locked onto Vince's face. "I'm giving you one chance," Jack said, his voice still that low, terrifying calm. "Put the gun down. Walk away. Right now." Paulie, emboldened by the weapon in Vince's hand, stepped forward. "You see this?" he said, gesturing at the gun. "You see this? You want to be a hero? You're going to get shot. This ain't your fight." Jack's eyes flicked to Emma, who was huddled against the wall, cradling her broken hand against her chest. Her face was bruised, her lips split, her eyes wide with pain and terror. But when she saw him, when she recognized him as Jack from the diner, a flicker of desperate hope crossed her face. He came, she thought, her mind struggling to comprehend it. He actually came. Jack's gaze moved back to Vince, and in that moment his assessment was complete. Primary threat, Vince, armed. Distance, 20 feet. Weapon pointed, but grip is terrible. He's shaken. If he fires, he'll miss. Secondary threat, Paulie. Large, aggressive. Distance, 15 feet. Unarmed, overconfident. Tertiary threat, Sketch. Crowbar. Distance, 18 feet. Panicking. Flight risk, civilian. Emma, injured. Distance, 25 feet. Against wall. Clear line to extract. The tactical picture was crystalline. The path forward was obvious. "Last chance," Jack said. Sketch, his nerve finally breaking, took a step back. "Vince, man, let's just go. Forget the girl, let's just—" "Shut up," Vince snarled. He looked back at Jack, trying to summon the bravado that the drugs had given him, trying to reassert control. "You don't get it, do you? I've got the gun. You've got nothing. So why don't you and your dog turn around and—" He never finished the sentence, because Havoc moved. Jack hadn't given a verbal command. He'd given a hand signal, a slight movement of his left hand, a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible in the dim light. But Havoc saw it, and Havoc, a 90-pound missile of trained aggression, exploded forward. The Belgian Malinois covered the 15 feet to Paulie in less than 2 seconds. There was no warning bark, no growl. There was only the sudden, terrifying rush of movement, a blur of fawn and black fur, and then the impact. Havoc hit Paulie low, his jaws clamping onto the man's right thigh with a force that could generate over 300 pounds of pressure per square inch. His teeth, designed by evolution and honed by training, sank through denim and into muscle. Paulie's scream was high and shrill, a sound of pure animalistic pain. He staggered back, trying to shake the dog off, but Havoc held on, his entire body weight pulling the larger man off balance. Vince, panicked, swung the gun toward the dog. It was the opportunity Jack had been waiting for. He moved. Jack crossed the distance in 3 long, explosive strides. His right hand shot out, grabbing Vince's wrist and yanking it upward just as the man's finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the narrow alley, the muzzle flash bright and brief. The bullet went wild, punching a hole in the brick wall above Emma's head, sending chips of masonry raining down. But Jack didn't stop. His momentum carried him forward, his grip on Vince's wrist tightening like a vice. He twisted, using leverage and body mechanics, and there was a sharp, wet pop as Vince's wrist dislocated. The gun clattered to the pavement. Vince shrieked, his other hand flailing, trying to claw at Jack's face. Jack drove his knee into the man's solar plexus, a brutal, precise strike that folded Vince in half, driving all the air from his lungs. Vince dropped to his knees, gasping, his face purple. Sketch, seeing his 2 companions go down in the span of 5 seconds, made a decision. He ran. He bolted for the mouth of the alley, the crowbar falling from his nerveless fingers, clattering against the pavement. He didn't look back. He just ran, his footsteps echoing, fading into the night. Jack let him go, one threat at a time. He turned his attention back to Paulie, who was on the ground now, screaming, trying to pry Havoc's jaws from his leg. The dog's grip was unrelenting, his amber eyes locked onto his target. "Aus," Jack commanded, his voice sharp. "Release." Instantly, Havoc's jaws opened. He stepped back, his body still coiled, ready but awaiting further orders. Paulie rolled onto his side, clutching his mangled thigh, blood seeping between his fingers. Jack stood in the center of the alley, breathing evenly, his hands loose at his sides. Vince was on his knees, cradling his dislocated wrist. Paulie was incapacitated, in shock from blood loss and pain. Sketch was gone. The fight had lasted less than 15 seconds. The alley was silent except for the harsh, ragged breathing of the two wounded men and Emma's soft, broken sobs. Jack turned and looked at her. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, with awe, with a desperate, overwhelming relief. He crossed to her, kneeling down beside her, his movements suddenly gentle, all the violence gone from his posture. "Emma," he said softly, "it's okay, you're safe." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her bruised face. "Bella," she whispered, her voice raw. "They hurt Bella. I have to." "I know," Jack said. "We'll get to her. But first, let me see your hand." She held out her broken hand, and Jack's jaw tightened at the sight of the unnatural angles of her fingers. But his touch was careful, professional, as he gently cradled her wrist. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said. "But right now, I need you to stay still. Can you do that?" Emma nodded, her body still trembling. From the diner's back door, Rosie appeared, her face pale, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, officer," she was saying, her voice shaking. "We need police and an ambulance. There's been a robbery, and there are injured people." Jack looked back at Havoc, who had taken up a position between Emma and the two fallen men, his body a living barrier. "Be watching," Jack said quietly. "Guard." The dog settled into a sphinx position, his eyes never leaving Vince and Paulie, his message clear. "Try to move, and I will end you." And as the distant sound of sirens began to rise in the night air, Jack stayed kneeling beside Emma, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his presence a silent promise. "You're safe now. I've got you. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty." The alley had transformed from a place of violence into something else. A crime scene, a place of reckoning, a space where the natural order had been violently restored. Vince remained on his knees, his dislocated wrist cradled against his chest, his face a mask of agony and defeat. He'd stopped struggling. The drugs were wearing off, reality crashing in, and with it came the crushing weight of what had just happened. He'd been taken down in seconds, by one man and a dog. Paulie lay on his side, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The bite wound on his thigh was deep, the denim of his jeans dark with blood. He kept looking at Havoc, who sat like a statue between him and Emma, and every time his eyes met those amber, unblinking orbs, he whimpered. The sirens were closer now, their wail cutting through the quiet residential streets that surrounded the industrial district. Red and blue lights would be painting the buildings within minutes. Jack remained kneeling beside Emma, his hand still resting on her shoulder. A grounding point, an anchor. She was shaking less now, her breathing beginning to regulate, though her broken hand was cradled protectively against her chest. "Jack," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't understand. How did you—" "Later," Jack said gently. "Right now, I need you to focus on staying calm. Your hand needs medical attention. Your ribs might be bruised or broken. The paramedics will be here soon." Emma's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they weren't tears of pain. They were something else. Relief, gratitude. "You saved me," she breathed. "You and Havoc. You saved my life." Jack's expression softened, just a fraction. "Havoc's a good boy," he said quietly. "He just doesn't like it when people hurt his friends." At the sound of his name, Havoc's ears swiveled toward Jack, though his eyes remained locked on the two men. His tail gave a single, disciplined thump against the wet pavement. Rosie appeared in the doorway again, her phone still pressed to her ear, but she ended the call as she took in the scene. "Ambulance is 3 minutes out," she said, her voice steadier now. "Police are 2. She looked at Jack, really looked at him. This quiet man who had sat in her diner 3 nights a week for months, always polite, always tipping well, never causing trouble. And in the span of 15 seconds he had moved like something out of a movie, taken down 2 armed men, and saved Emma's life. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was focused on Emma, on making sure she was stable, but finally he spoke, his voice still that low, calm rumble. "Just a customer, Rosie. Just someone who couldn't sit by and watch." Vince, through his haze of pain, heard the exchange. He looked up at Jack, really seeing him for the first time, not just a man, but the way he moved, the precision, the cold, clinical efficiency, the absolute lack of fear. "You're military," Vince rasped, his voice barely audible. "Aren't you?" Jack's gray eyes shifted to him, and the look in them was enough to make Vince flinch. "I was," Jack said simply. What branch?" Vince asked, though some part of him didn't want to know the answer. Jack stood, his full height and presence now towering over the kneeling man. "Does it matter?" But Rosie, who had been listening, stepped forward. "He's a Navy SEAL," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Emma told me once. She'd seen his dog tags when they fell out of his jacket. She looked it up." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Vince's face went ashen. A Navy SEAL. He'd pulled a gun on a Navy SEAL. He'd threatened, assaulted, and tried to rob people while a trained special operator sat in the back booth, watching. The full weight of his mistake crashed down on him, and he let out a choked, broken sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Paulie heard it too, and he turned his face to the pavement, groaning. "We're so screwed," he muttered. The first police cruiser screeched into the alley entrance, its lights strobing, its siren cutting off mid-wail. 2 officers emerged, their hands on their holsters, their eyes scanning the scene. "Police! Everyone stay where you are!" Jack raised his hands slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "2 suspects on the ground," he called out, his voice calm and clear. "Both injured, non-combative. One fled on foot, heading east. Civilian injured, needs medical attention." The lead officer, a veteran named Sergeant Hammond, took in the scene with sharp, experienced eyes. He saw the 2 men on the ground, one cradling a wrist, one bleeding from a leg wound. He saw the woman against the wall, clearly hurt. He saw the man with his hands raised, standing calm and steady, and he saw the dog sitting like a sentinel. "Sir, I need you to step away from the suspects," Hammond said, his hand still on his weapon. "Understood," Jack said. He looked down at Havoc. "Higher," he commanded softly. The Belgian Malinois rose fluidly and moved to Jack's side, sitting in a perfect heel position. Hammond's eyes widened slightly. He'd seen military working dogs before. He knew what they were capable of. "That's a trained K-9, he said, more statement than question. "Retired MWD, Jack confirmed. "He's under control." The second officer moved to secure Vince and Paulie, pulling out zip-tie cuffs and reading them their rights as they groaned in pain. Hammond approached Jack, his hand now off his weapon, his demeanor shifting from defensive to curious. "You take these two down yourself?" he asked. "They gave me no choice," Jack said simply. "They assaulted the waitress. I intervened." Hammond looked at Emma, at her bruised face and broken hand, and his jaw tightened. "I'd say you intervened just fine." He glanced back at the two suspects. "What happened to them?" "The one on the left has a dislocated wrist," Jack said, his tone clinical. "The one on the right has a dog bite to the right thigh, approximately 3 inches deep. Both will need medical attention before transport." Hammond nodded slowly. "And you are?" "Jack Reeves. I was a customer in the diner when these three came in and robbed the place. They dragged Miss Chen out here and assaulted her. I followed." "Jack Reeves," Hammond repeated, pulling out a notepad. "Can I see some ID?" Jack reached slowly into his back pocket and withdrew his wallet, handing over his driver's license. Hammond studied it, then looked up at Jack with new respect. "You're the maritime security consultant who works at the port, aren't you?" "I am." "And before that?" Jack hesitated, then said quietly, "Navy, Special Operations." Hammond let out a low whistle. "Well, Mr. Reeves, I'd say these boys picked the wrong diner to rob." He handed back the license. "I'm going to need a full statement from you, but first, let's make sure the victim's taken care of." As if on cue, the ambulance pulled into the alley, its lights flashing, and two paramedics jumped out, their bags already in hand. Jack stepped aside, giving them room to work. One of the paramedics, a young woman named Lisa, knelt beside Emma. "Ma'am, I'm Lisa. I'm here to help. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" Emma's voice was weak. "My hand. My ribs. He kicked me." Lisa's face hardened as she saw the broken fingers, the bruises already forming. "Okay. We're going to get you stabilized and transported. You're going to be okay." The second paramedic moved to Vince and Paulie, assessing their injuries with professional detachment. Jack watched from a few feet away, Havoc still at his side. The dog's ears were forward, his body relaxed now that the immediate threat had passed, but his eyes remained alert, watchful. Rosie approached Jack, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for saving her. Emma, she's like family to me. If you hadn't been there..." Jack's expression softened. "I'm glad I was." "But Bella," Rosie said suddenly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God, Emma's dog. That man hit her with a crowbar. She's still in the office." Jack's head snapped toward the diner. "Is the office door still open?" "I think so." "Stay here," Jack said. He looked down at Havoc. "Blybe, stay." The dog sat, his gaze following Jack as he moved quickly back through the kitchen and into the small office. The scene inside made Jack's chest tighten. Bella lay on her side on the blanket, her breathing shallow and labored. Her shoulder was swollen, a dark bruise already spreading beneath her golden fur. She whimpered softly when she saw Jack, her tail giving a weak, painful thump. Jack knelt beside her, his hands moving over her body with the same careful precision he'd used on Emma. He could feel the heat of inflammation in her shoulder, the way she flinched when he touched it. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I know it hurts, but we're going to get you help." He looked back toward the alley where the paramedics were loading Emma onto a stretcher. He needed to get Bella medical attention, but he couldn't leave the scene. Not yet. Hammond appeared in the doorway. "Everything okay?" Jack gestured to the dog. "This is the victim's dog. She was assaulted by one of the suspects. She needs a vet." Hammond's face darkened. Animal cruelty on top of everything else. These guys just keep digging themselves deeper. He pulled out his radio. "I'll call the emergency vet clinic on 4th Street. They're open 24/7. Can you transport her?" Jack nodded. "I can." "Then do it. We've got your contact information. We'll take your statement later." Jack carefully slid his arms beneath Bella, lifting her with the same gentle care he'd shown Emma. The dog whimpered but didn't struggle, her dark eyes trusting. As Jack carried her through the kitchen, Emma, now on the stretcher, saw him. Her eyes widened. "Bella," she gasped. "Is she—" "She's alive," Jack said firmly. "I'm taking her to the vet right now. She's going to be okay." Emma's face crumpled and fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you, Jack. Please, please save her." "I will," Jack said. It wasn't a promise. It was a certainty. As the paramedics loaded Emma into the ambulance, Jack carried Bella out to his truck, Havoc trotting beside him. He laid the injured dog carefully on the back seat, using his jacket to cushion her, and Havoc immediately jumped in beside her, positioning himself protectively next to her. Jack climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As he pulled out of the alley, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The police were loading Vince and Polly into separate cruisers. Rosie stood in the doorway of the diner, watching him go, her hand raised in a small, grateful wave. Jack turned his eyes back to the road and drove into the night, his focus now on one thing, keeping his promise to Emma. The 24-hour veterinary clinic on 4th Street was a low, modern building with large windows and a brightly lit waiting room. Jack pulled into the emergency entrance, left the engine running, and carefully lifted Bella from the back seat. Havoc jumped down and immediately took up a position at Jack's side, his posture alert but calm. Jack pushed through the automatic doors and into the reception area. A young vet tech looked up from the desk, her eyes widening at the sight of the injured dog in his arms. "I need a vet," Jack said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Dog's been assaulted with a blunt object. Blunt force trauma to the left shoulder. Possible internal injuries." The tech was already moving, hitting a button on the wall. "Exam room 2. Dr. Alvarez is on duty." Jack carried Bella through the swinging doors into a clean, sterile exam room. A woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a bun was waiting. She gestured to the exam table. "Lay her here, gently." Jack complied, and Dr. Alvarez's hands were immediately on Bella, her touch expert and sure. She palpated the shoulder, listened to the dog's breathing, checked her gums. "Tell me what happened," she said, not looking up. "She was struck with a crowbar during a robbery. One blow to the left shoulder. She's been whimpering, favoring the leg. I don't know if there are internal injuries." Dr. Alvarez nodded, her face grim. "Okay. We need x-rays, possibly an ultrasound. She's going into shock, so we'll start an IV, get her stabilized." She looked up at Jack. "Are you the owner?" "No. The owner is Emma Chen. She's being transported to Tacoma General right now. I'm a friend." Dr. Alvarez studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll need you to sign a consent form as her agent. We'll do everything we can." "Do it," Jack said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." The vet tech appeared with a clipboard, and Jack scrawled his signature across the consent form. "You can wait in the lobby," Dr. Alvarez said. "This is going to take some time." Jack nodded and stepped back, allowing the vet team to work. He returned to the waiting room, Havoc still at his side, and sank into one of the hard plastic chairs. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was finally beginning to ebb, leaving in its wake a bone-deep exhaustion. His hands, he noticed, had a faint tremor, not from fear, from the aftermath, from the come-down. Havoc pressed his head against Jack's knee, and Jack dropped his hand to the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the soft fur behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "You did good, Havoc. You did real good." The dog's tail thumped once, twice, and then he settled at Jack's feet, his body a warm, solid presence. Jack leaned back, closing his eyes, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. He had come to Rosie's diner for peace, for quiet, for a refuge from the violence that had defined his life for so long, and instead, violence had found him. Again. But this time, it had been different. This time, he hadn't been fighting for a mission or a country or an objective. He'd been fighting for Emma, for a kind, hard-working woman who didn't deserve to be brutalized in an alley, for Bella, a gentle dog who'd been beaten for doing nothing more than existing. And in that fight, for the first time in a long time, Jack had felt something other than the cold, empty detachment of the operator. He'd felt righteous. He'd felt purpose. An hour passed, then 2. Jack sat in the waiting room, unmoving, Havoc dozing at his feet. Finally, Dr. Alvarez emerged, her scrubs speckled with blood, her face tired but satisfied. Jack was on his feet in an instant. "How is she?" "She's stable," Dr. Alvarez said. "The shoulder is badly bruised, but nothing's broken. No internal bleeding. She's a tough girl. We've got her on pain medication and fluids. She'll need to stay here for observation overnight, but I think she's going to make a full recovery." Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you." "You got her here fast," Dr. Alvarez said. "That made all the difference." She paused. "Can I ask what happened? Who would do this to a dog like her?" "Bad people," Jack said simply, "but they won't hurt anyone else." Dr. Alvarez nodded, as if that was all the answer she needed. "I'll call you when she's ready to be released. In the meantime, you should get some rest. You look like you've had a hell of a night." Jack managed a faint smile. "You could say that." He left the clinic, Havoc trotting beside him, and climbed back into his truck. He sat there for a moment, his hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the empty parking lot. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Sergeant Hammond. "Need your statement tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. at the precinct. Thanks for your help tonight. You're a good man, Reeves." Jack typed a quick reply. "I'll be there." He started the truck and drove home, the city lights blurring past the windows. When he finally pulled into the driveway of his small rental house on the outskirts of Tacoma, the sky was just beginning to lighten with the first pale hints of dawn. He let Havoc into the house, filled his bowl with food and water, and then collapsed onto the couch, too tired to make it to the bedroom. As he closed his eyes, his last thought was of Emma's face, bruised, broken, but alive, and Bella, her gentle eyes trusting him even in her pain. He'd kept his promise. They were safe, and for tonight, that was enough. Jack woke to the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the coffee table. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, bright and unforgiving. He blinked, disoriented, his body stiff from sleeping on the couch in his clothes. He grabbed the phone. The screen showed 8:15 a.m. He'd slept for less than 4 hours. There were 12 missed calls and 15 text messages. The first call was from Sergeant Hammond. The texts were from Rosie, from Dr. Alvarez, and from a number he didn't recognize. Jack sat up, rubbing his face, and started scrolling through the messages. Rosie: Jack, thank you again for what you did last night. Emma is asking about Bella. Please let me know how she is. Dr. Alvarez: Bella had a good night. She's eating and her vitals are strong. You can pick her up this afternoon. Unknown. Number: Mr. Reeves, this is Officer Hammond. Please call me when you're awake. We need to discuss something. Jack frowned and dialed Hammond's number. The sergeant answered on the first ring. Reeves, glad you're up. How's the dog? Stable. I'm picking her up this afternoon. Good. Listen, I need you to come in this morning for your statement like we discussed, but there's something else. The 2 suspects you took down last night, Vince Maroney and Paul Dzinski, they've been singing like canaries. Jack's frown deepened. About what? About a lot of things. Turns out this wasn't their first robbery. They've been hitting diners and convenience stores all over the city for the past 6 weeks. Small operations, quick hits. But here's where it gets interesting. Hammond paused. They're part of a larger crew. The guy who ran, Sketch, real name is Tyler Brooks. He's the nephew of a man named Dmitri Volkov. Jack's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Everyone in Tacoma who worked the waterfront knew that name. Dmitri Volkov ran the port's black market. Smuggling, extortion, labor racketeering. He was careful, insulated by layers of legitimate businesses and fall guys. The police had been trying to build a case against him for years, but he was slippery, untouchable. Let me guess, Jack said. Volkov's been using these kids to fund his operations. Small robberies, low risk, high cash flow. Exactly. And now that we've got 2 of them in custody, they're willing to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. The DA is salivating. This could be the break we've been waiting for. Jack was silent for a moment, processing. What does this have to do with me? Volkov knows you took down his guys, and he knows they're talking. Tyler Brooks, Sketch, he went straight to his uncle last night, told him everything, including the fact that a Navy SEAL intervened. A cold knot formed in Jack's stomach. Hammond, I'm retired. I'm a civilian now. I know, but Volkov doesn't care. To him, you're a threat. You humiliated his crew, you sent 2 of them to the hospital, and now they're cooperating with the police. He's going to want to send a message. Jack stood, his mind already shifting into operational mode. What kind of message? The kind that involves making sure you can't testify, or making an example out of you so his other guys stay loyal. Hammond's voice was grim. I'm not saying this to scare you, Reeves. I'm saying this because you need to be careful. Volkov's got reach. He's got people everywhere. The docks, the streets, even some of the local PD. Jack's eyes hardened. Are you telling me there are dirty cops in your department? I'm telling you I don't know who to trust, which is why I'm calling you directly, off the record. Hammond took a breath. Look, I can't offer you protection. We don't have the resources, but I can tell you to watch your back. Keep your dog close, and if anything feels off, you call me. Immediately. Jack ran a hand through his hair. Understood. I'll be there at 9 for my statement. One more thing, Hammond said. The waitress, Emma Chen. She's being released from the hospital this afternoon. Broken hand, 3 cracked ribs, contusions. But she's tough. She's asking about you and about her dog. I'll make sure Bella gets back to her, Jack said. Good, because I have a feeling Emma's going to need a friend right now. Volkov's not just going to come after you, Reeves. He's going to come after everyone involved in this. The call ended. Jack stood in the middle of his living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and felt the familiar cold clarity settle over him. The peace he'd been chasing, the quiet life he'd been trying to build, it had just been shattered. Violence had found him again, and this time it wasn't going to stop with a simple robbery in an alley. Havoc, sensing the shift in his handler's energy, rose from his spot by the couch and came to stand beside him, his amber eyes alert. Jack looked down at the dog, his partner, his brother. "Looks like we've got a mission, boy," he said quietly. The Tacoma Police Department's main precinct was a squat, gray building that smelled of old coffee and bureaucracy. Jack arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, Havoc walking calmly at his side. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked up from his paperwork and did a double take at the sight of the Belgian Malinois. "That a service dog?" he asked. "Retired military working dog," Jack said. "He stays with me." The sergeant shrugged. "Hammond's expecting you. 3rd floor, interview room B." Jack took the stairs, Havoc's nails clicking softly on the linoleum. He found Hammond waiting in a small, windowless room with a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device. "Reeves, thanks for coming in." Hammond gestured to the chair. "This shouldn't take long. Just need to get your account of what happened on record." For the next hour, Jack walked Hammond through the events of the previous night in precise, clinical detail. The robbery, the assault, the intervention. He left nothing out, his memory sharp and clear. When he was finished, Hammond leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "You know, if I didn't have Rosie and the trucker corroborating every word of this, I'd think you were making it up. 15 seconds to neutralize 2 armed suspects, that's impressive." "It's training," Jack said simply. Hammond nodded, then leaned forward. "Off the record, I'm glad you were there. Emma Chen's a good kid. She volunteers at the community center, helps at-risk youth with their homework. She didn't deserve what those animals did to her." "No one deserves that," Jack said. "You're right." Hammond paused. "I meant what I said on the phone. Volkov's going to come after you. You need to be prepared." "I am." Hammond studied him for a long moment. "You got a weapon?" "I have several." "Good. Keep them close." He stood. "We're done here. You're free to go. But Reeves, thank you for what you did, not just for Emma, but for giving us a shot at taking down Volkov." Jack nodded and left the precinct, Havoc at his side. His next stop was Tacoma General Hospital. Emma was in a room on the 4th floor, her left hand wrapped in a cast, her ribs taped. She looked small in the hospital bed, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes. But when she saw Jack walk through the door, her entire expression transformed. "Jack," she breathed, her voice hoarse. "You came." "I promised I'd update you on Bella," Jack said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "She's okay. Bruised shoulder, but no broken bones. The vet says she'll make a full recovery. I'm picking her up this afternoon." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Jack said. "Yes, I do." Emma's voice was fierce despite its weakness. "You saved my life, Jack, and you saved Bella. You're a hero." Jack looked uncomfortable. I'm not a hero, Emma. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time." "No." Emma shook her head, wincing at the pain the movement caused. "Rosie told me about who you are, what you were. Navy SEAL. You could have just sat there. You could have let them take me, but you didn't." Jack was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I couldn't." Emma reached out with her good hand and took his, squeezing it gently. "Well, I'm glad you couldn't. Because of you, I get to go home. I get to see Bella again. I get to live." Jack squeezed her hand back, his grip warm and steady. "When are they releasing you?" "This afternoon, around 3, Rosie's going to pick me up and take me back to my apartment." "I'll bring Bella to you," Jack said. "Tonight, around 7. Emma's smile was radiant despite the bruises. "I'd like that." As Jack stood to leave, Emma called out softly, "Jack, be careful. I heard the nurses talking. They said the men who did this, they're part of something bigger, something dangerous." "I know," Jack said, "and I will." He left the hospital and drove to the vet clinic where Dr. Alvarez had Bella waiting in a recovery kennel. The golden retriever's tail wagged weakly when she saw him, and Jack knelt down, scratching her behind the ears. "You're a tough girl," he murmured. "Emma's waiting for you." He loaded Bella carefully into the truck, Havoc immediately moving to sit beside her, and drove back to his house. He settled both dogs in the living room with food and water, then went to his bedroom and unlocked the gun safe in his closet. Inside were 3 handguns, a tactical shotgun, and his old service rifle. He pulled out a Glock 19, checked the magazine, and holstered it at his hip. If Volkov was coming, Jack would be ready. At 7 p.m., Jack pulled up outside Emma's apartment building, a modest 3-story walk-up in a quiet neighborhood. Bella sat in the passenger seat, her tail wagging at the sight of the familiar building. Jack helped the dog out of the truck and walked her slowly to the entrance, mindful of her injured shoulder. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor and knocked on apartment 2B. Emma answered, her face lighting up at the sight of her dog. "Bella!" The golden retriever lunged forward, whining with joy, and Emma sank to her knees, wrapping her good arm around the dog's neck, burying her face in her fur. Jack stood in the doorway, watching the reunion, and felt something warm settle in his chest. After a moment, Emma looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Come in, please." Jack hesitated, then stepped inside. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with books, houseplants, and the warm glow of string lights. It was a home. "I made tea," Emma said, gesturing to the small kitchen table where 2 mugs sat waiting. "It's the least I can do." Jack sat, and Emma joined him, Bella settling at her feet with a contented sigh. They talked for over an hour, about the robbery, about Emma's studies, about Jack's work at the port. Emma asked him about his time in the Navy, and Jack, for the first time in years, found himself talking about it. Not the violence, not the missions, but the brotherhood, the purpose. And as the evening wore on, Jack realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. He'd found something worth protecting again. But that peace was shattered by a knock on the door. Emma frowned. "I'm not expecting anyone." Jack was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the Glock at his hip. "Stay here." He moved to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 men stood in the hallway, both wearing dark suits, their faces hard and unfriendly. Jack opened the door a crack, blocking it with his body. "Can I help you?" The taller of the 2 men smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Jack Reeves." "Who's asking?" "My name is Alexei. I work for Mr. Volkov. He'd like to have a word with you." Jack's jaw tightened. "Tell Mr. Volkov I'm not interested." Alexei's smile widened. "He insists." "And I insist you leave," Jack said, his voice cold. Alexei glanced past Jack into the apartment, and his eyes landed on Emma. Pretty girl. It would be a shame if something happened to her. It was the wrong thing to say. Jack's hand shot out, grabbing Alexei by the tie and yanking him forward, slamming him against the doorframe. "You go back to Volkov and tell him this. If he or any of his people come near Emma, near her dog, near anyone I care about, I will end him. Do you understand?" Alexei's face had gone pale. He nodded jerkily. Jack released him, and the two men stumbled back, retreating down the hallway. Jack closed the door and turned to Emma, who was standing in the kitchen, her eyes wide. "Jack, what was that?" "That," Jack said grimly, "was a message from the man who sent those guys to rob the diner. He's trying to scare me. Scare us." Emma's face set in determination. "What do we do?" Jack looked at her, this brave, resilient woman who'd been through hell and was still standing, and made a decision. "We fight back." End of part 4. 2,400 words. Total, 10,800 words. The van drove for 20 minutes, winding through the dark streets of Tacoma's industrial outskirts. When it finally stopped, Jack was hauled out and found himself standing in front of an old meatpacking plant, one of Volkov's properties, according to Hammond's intel. They dragged him inside. Havoc pulled along on a short leash by one of the guards. The interior was cavernous and cold, filled with rusted equipment and the faint, sickly sweet smell of old blood. In the center of the space, sitting in a leather chair like a king on a throne, was Dmitri Volkov. He was a man in his late 50s, powerfully built, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of ice. He wore an expensive suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the decrepit surroundings. "Mr. Reeves," Volkov said, his voice a cultured baritone with only a hint of an accent. "Thank you for joining me." "I didn't have much choice," Jack said. Volkov smiled. "True, but then you made your own choices, didn't you? You chose to interfere in my business. You chose to assault my men. You chose to spy on my operations." He stood, approaching Jack with slow, measured steps. "These were all very poor choices. Your men robbed a diner and beat a woman. That's not business. That's thuggery." "Semantics." Volkov waved a hand dismissively. "The point is, you have become a problem, and I solve problems. By threatening innocent people? By smuggling weapons?" Volkov's expression hardened. "You know nothing about my work, nothing about the empire I have built. I provide a service. I move goods that people need. I employ hundreds. I keep order in this city." "You're a criminal," Jack said flatly. Volkov's backhanded slap was swift and brutal, snapping Jack's head to the side. Blood trickled from his split lip. "You will show respect," Volkov hissed. Havoc lunged against his restraints, snarling, but the guard holding him yanked the leash hard, choking the dog. Jack's vision went red. "Let him go." Volkov studied him, then smiled slowly. "You care about this animal. Interesting." He gestured to the guard. "Bring the dog here." They dragged Havoc forward, and Volkov pulled a pistol from his jacket, pressing it against the dog's head. "Now," Volkov said calmly, "you will tell me what you did with the photographs, who you sent them to, and then you will call the police and recant your statement about my men. Do this, and I let you and your dog live." Jack's mind was racing. The SD card was still in his boot. If he could just buy enough time. "I sent the photos to Sergeant Hammond," Jack lied smoothly. He's probably already got a warrant. Volkov's eyes narrowed. You're lying. Am I? The crime boss's finger tightened on the trigger, and then, from the darkness of the warehouse came a new sound. The wail of sirens. Lots of them. Volkov's head snapped toward the entrance. What? The doors burst open, and a flood of police officers in tactical gear poured in, weapons drawn. Police! Hands in the air! Volkov's men scattered, some raising their hands, others running for side exits. But the police had the building surrounded. Sergeant Hammond strode through the chaos, his weapon trained on Volkov. Drop the gun, Dmitri. It's over. Volkov's face twisted with rage. You have no cause to be here. No warrant. We have probable cause, Hammond said. An anonymous tip about weapons trafficking at this location. And look at that. He gestured to a stack of crates in the corner, clearly marked with the same symbols Jack had photographed. Looks like our tip was good. Volkov realized he was beaten. He lowered the gun slowly, and 2 officers rushed forward to handcuff him. Hammond approached Jack, cutting the zip ties binding his wrists. You okay? How did you know where I was? Jack asked. Hammond held up a small GPS tracker. I slipped this into your jacket pocket 3 days ago. Figured you'd do something reckless. He smiled. Good thing I was right. Jack looked at Havoc, who was being freed by another officer. The dog immediately ran to him, pressing against his legs. The photos? Hammond asked quietly. Jack reached down and pulled the SD card from his boot, handing it over. Everything you need. Hammond pocketed it with a grin. Outstanding work, Mr. Reeves, hypothetically speaking. As the police led Volkov and his men out in handcuffs, Jack knelt beside Havoc, checking him over for injuries. The dog was fine, shaken but unharmed. Good boy, Jack murmured, scratching behind his ears. Such a good boy. Hammond approached again. We'll need your statement, but after that, you're free to go. And Reeves, this time, Volkov's not walking. We've got him on weapons trafficking, kidnapping, and attempted murder. He's done. Jack nodded, relief washing over him. It was finally over. 2 weeks later, Jack sat in the gallery of the Tacoma courthouse, watching as Dmitri Volkov was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. The once powerful crime boss looked diminished, his face haggard, his shoulders slumped. Emma sat beside Jack, her cast removed, her hand still wrapped in a brace but healing. Bella sat at her feet, her tail wagging softly. The judge read the charges: weapons trafficking, racketeering, kidnapping, assault, attempted murder. The list went on, and one by one, Volkov's empire crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The SD card Jack had recovered contained not just photos, but metadata that linked the shipments to Volkov's accounts. Vince and Polly, facing decades in prison, had testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences, and Hammond's team had seized enough weapons and financial records to bury Volkov for life. When the judge handed down the sentence, 40 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole, Emma reached over and squeezed Jack's hand. It's over, she whispered. It's over, Jack agreed. Outside the courthouse, Hammond was waiting. Hell of a job, Reeves. The DA says this is the biggest organized crime bust in Tacoma's history. I didn't do it alone, Jack said. No, but you started it. Hammond extended his hand. Thank you for everything. Jack shook it, just doing what was right. As they walked away from the courthouse, Emma looked up at Jack. What now? Jack smiled. Now we go back to normal. I go back to my booth at Rosie's. You go back to school. and we try to forget any of this ever happened." Emma laughed. "Somehow, I don't think I'll ever forget." "Me neither," Jack admitted. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Emma said quietly, "Jack, thank you for saving me, for saving Bella, for everything." Jack stopped and turned to her. "You don't have to thank me, Emma." "Yes, I do, because you didn't just save my life. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Jack felt something warm settle in his chest. "You would have done the same?" "Maybe, but I didn't have to." "You did." She smiled. "You're a hero, Jack Reeves, whether you want to admit it or not." Jack didn't have an answer for that, so he just smiled and kept walking. That evening, Jack returned to Rosie's diner for the first time since the robbery. The neon sign glowed in the window, cheerful and familiar. Inside, the warm smells of coffee and bacon greeted him like an old friend. Rosie was behind the counter, and when she saw him, her face lit up. "Jack, oh honey, come here." She came around the counter and pulled him into a fierce hug. Thank you for saving Emma. Thank you for being there when we needed you." "It's good to be back, Rosie," Jack said simply. His booth in the back was waiting, as if it had been reserved just for him. He slid into the familiar vinyl seat, and Havoc settled at his feet with a contented sigh. Emma appeared a moment later, wearing her pale blue uniform and white apron, her smile radiant. "Welcome back," she said. "The usual?" "The usual," Jack confirmed. As she poured his coffee, he noticed something different. The other customers, the regulars he'd seen week after week, were looking at him differently. Not with suspicion or wariness, but with respect, with gratitude. Mr. Peterson raised his coffee mug in a silent salute. The trucker from booth 4 nodded. Even the cook gave him a thumbs up through the kitchen window. Word had spread. The quiet man in the back booth wasn't just a customer. He was a protector, a guardian. Emma returned with his steak and eggs, and as always, one strip of bacon, accidentally, fell to the floor beside Havoc's waiting muzzle. Jack gave his nod, and the dog delicately accepted the treat. Emma sat down across from him, something she'd never done before. "Do you mind?" "Not at all." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Emma said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about normal." "Yeah? I don't think I want normal anymore. Not if normal means looking the other way when people need help." She looked at him, her eyes serious. "I want to be like you, Jack. I want to stand up. I want to make a difference." Jack smiled. "You already do, Emma. Every day. With your students, your volunteer work, the way you treat people. You don't need to be a Navy SEAL to be a hero." "Maybe not, but I can learn from one." Jack considered her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, then let's make a deal. I'll teach you self-defense, how to protect yourself if something like this ever happens again. And in return, you keep being you. Keep making the world a little bit brighter." Emma extended her good hand across the table. "Deal." They shook on it. As Jack finished his meal and Emma returned to her shift, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the fragile, temporary kind he'd been chasing, but the deep, solid peace that came from knowing he'd done the right thing, that he'd protected someone who couldn't protect themselves, that he'd made a difference. Beneath the table, Havoc's tail thumped softly against the floor, and Jack reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. "We did good, didn't we?" The dog's amber eyes looked up at him, and in them Jack saw complete trust, complete loyalty. They had found their purpose again, not in war, not in violence, but in protection, in standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. And that, Jack realized, was enough. As the weeks turned into months, life in Tacoma slowly returned to normal. Dmitri Volkov's criminal empire was dismantled, his lieutenants arrested, his operations shut down. The waterfront, once a haven for smugglers and extortionists, began to heal. Emma returned to her studies, her broken hand healing well enough to type her thesis. She graduated with honors and accepted a job at a nonprofit that helped survivors of violence rebuild their lives. And twice a week, she met Jack at the gym he'd recommended, where he taught her the basics of self-defense. Not to make her a warrior, but to give her the confidence to never feel helpless again. Bella, fully recovered, became something of a celebrity at the diner. Regulars would stop by just to give her treats and scratches, and she accepted the attention with her characteristic gentle grace. Rosie's diner thrived. The story of the robbery, and the Navy SEAL who had stopped it, had brought a wave of new customers, drawn by curiosity and staying for the food and the warm atmosphere. Rosie hired another waitress to handle the increased traffic, but Emma still worked her shifts, saving money for the future. And Jack? Jack returned to his quiet life, but it was different now. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't running from his past or trying to forget who he'd been. He'd found a way to use his skills, his training, his instincts, not for destruction, but for protection. He became a fixture in the community. When a local veteran struggled with PTSD, Jack was there to talk, to listen, to help. When a teenager was being bullied, Jack taught him how to stand tall, how to defend himself without resorting to violence. When Emma's nonprofit needed security for an event, Jack volunteered. He was still the quiet man in the back booth, but he was also a guardian, a protector, a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or carry badges. Sometimes they just sit in diners, drinking coffee, eating steak and eggs, waiting for the moment when they're needed most. One evening, as Jack sat in his booth with Havoc at his feet, Emma brought over his usual meal, but this time she included something extra, a small, handwritten note. Jack unfolded it and read, "Thank you for showing me that one person can make a difference. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're afraid. You changed my life, Jack, and I'll spend the rest of it trying to be half as brave as you. Emma." Jack folded the note carefully and tucked it into his wallet. He looked up at Emma, who was watching him with a soft smile. "You're already brave, Emma," he said. "You always were." She squeezed his shoulder and returned to her work. As Jack cut into his steak, he glanced down at Havoc, who was resting his head on his paws, watching the diner with calm, alert eyes. "We found it, didn't we, boy?" Jack murmured. "We found our place." Havoc's tail thumped once in agreement, and as the diner hummed with life around him, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the warm glow of the lights, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt home. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Havoc's loyalty when he took down the robber? Jack's protective instinct when he couldn't just sit and watch? Or the moment Emma realized she had a guardian she never knew she needed?